Okay, so this is going to be a full kind of beginner's tutorial for the Oberheim OB-X8. It is a pretty complicated synth at first glance, especially if you're coming from like a mini Moog or a subsequent 37, which lays out the signal flow pretty logically. In this video, which is kind of, I'll admit, like rinky-dink in setup, I intend to go through majority of the components and signal flow knowledge required to start developing patches and kind of partake in subtractive synthesis yourself. So this video is geared at primarily beginners, and I will skip over some features. In the case that you feel you want them to be covered, I will make an advanced video if you just let me know in the comments down below if you're interested in something like that, and I will do it. But okay, so to begin, subtractive synthesis is sort of, in a way, layering different waveforms, which are all of their own individual characteristics, and then using things like filters and modulation to sort of shape them into something that you're particularly happy with, or that you kind of want sonic wise. Where you typically start with subtractive synthesis is a basic waveform, and then you kind of layer waveforms on top of that to do so, to kind of develop the sound that you want. So how you begin on the subsequent, or the Oberheim OB-X8 is you have multiple sections which all sort of speak to each other, but interestingly and kind of inconveniently for beginners, it doesn't flow left to right like most people would expect, especially if you come from like sort of an audio interface where, or a DAW where things kind of go top down. Typically in audio, things flow in one way. This kind of jumps all around in different modules. You have the master, which kind of controls the master effects, like the audio volume coming out. You have the control, which allows for interesting effects like your vintage mode, which kind of makes the synth sound more dated in a good way. You have your portamento, which is like slide, and then you have your velocity and your touch buttons, which kind of allow for harsher, or not harsher, I guess, just more expressive playing. Touch would be aftertouch, so how hard you push down, and velocity is how hard you hit, and then unison, which sort of sums the synth to become kind of a mono synth, which is really good for bass and introduces more power. And you have your oscillator 2 detune, which it's good for if you want like kind of a really thick analog flavor, specifically for bass lines, especially for bass lines. And then you have your modulation section. So this section, you can choose an LFO and an LFO shape. So you have your shapes here, and then you have your rate, which essentially is like a low frequency oscillator, which allows you to kind of automate different effects on the synthesizer, which we'll get into. And then you have your destination, where you can send those effects: oscillator 1 pitch, oscillator 2 pitch, filter modulation, so it opens and closes the filter, pulse wave width modulation for oscillator 1, pulse wave width modulation for oscillator 2, and then volume oscillation. And then depth knobs kind of say how deep do I want the modulation to be, or sort of how mixed in do I want the effect. And then you have your oscillator section, which is where you kind of choose your waveform shapes and their frequency. And then you have your pulse width, which kind of chooses how wide the pulse is for the square wave shape. For the sake of this video, we are going to ignore the keyboard section. It's not very relevant for beginners. Filter is the filter section, which allows you to cut high frequencies out of your sound, and the filter type button kind of says how extreme do I want the filter to impact my sound. So you have a choice between 3 different filters, and when both lights are lit up, that's the kind of heaviest filter. Here, let me just give you an example. So the filter open all the way, and then I'll close it. So that's kind of how the filter knob works there. And then you have your resonance knob, which that pretty much, where the filter cuts off, boosts a frequency. So you kind of have a sound that's a bit sharp at the cutoff. Admittedly, that's not the best example, but we will get more into it. And then you have your modulation knob, which brings us over to the filters, or to the filter envelope section. The modulation knob here in the filter zone kind of says, when we get into filter modulation, how impactful do we want the filter modulation to be? You have your ADSR, so attack, decay, sustain, release. As you do for the volume envelope, you have your attack, decay, sustain, release. So attack is essentially when you hit down, how long do you want to have to hold before the sound reaches max volume. And you have your sustain, which is after it reaches max volume, the sound must fall down somewhere. And the decay knob says how long should it take from peak attack to fall down to that sustain point. So think of sustain like a level you set. You say, I want it to fall down to this quiet of volume. Decay says, how long do you want it to take to fall to that volume? And then release is when you lift your finger up, how much do you want the note to ring out, sort of like a reverb. And then you have your programming section, which right off rip kind of allows you to choose different presets, which there are a ton on the Oberheim preloaded. But now that we've got that all out of the way, the presets are not really the point of the video. I will make one for the presets eventually. How do you start synthesizing right off rip? So it's not extremely intuitive, but what you do to kind of strip things down to their bare bones is you click the manual button and the right button at the same time, which brings you to a basic program. So it's kind of like a, you have a saw wave and just one oscillator at a time. I purposely ignored the filter zone oscillator 1, 2, and noise when I was introducing this side of the synth, because that's really where you start. So ignore everything right now except for these two buttons. If I click oscillator 1, you hear nothing, because oscillator 1 is now turned off. Interestingly enough, in the filter section, that is where you control what oscillator is on and what's off. In my mind, it would be easier and more convenient if that was in the oscillator section, and a lot of other people I've spoken to as well. But that's just how it works here. So if we want oscillator 1 to be turned on, we click oscillator 1. If we want to choose our waveform, you do so here. So if you turn off saw, you have something that kind of resembles a sine wave, a pure sine. It's a bit harsh on the top end, so it's not pure, but it's a sine. You click saw, and you get a saw. You click pulse, and you get a pulse. If you have them both lit up, you get a triangle. Okay, so that's how you kind of design a sound from scratch. Right off rip, you turn on the oscillator and filter, and then you choose the kind of waveform that you want. How do you turn on oscillator 2? Well, you just click oscillator 2 here, and then you have the option to utilize that oscillator atop or just alongside or below oscillator 1's tone. So right off rip, if we turn off saw, it's kind of hard to hear, but if we turn off oscillator 1, that's kind of our pure sine, kind of playing under the triangle that we have in oscillator 1. We can start, maybe if we want a sawtooth playing on oscillator 2, we just click saw. And if you listen really carefully while I hold the C note here, you'll hear kind of a phasing, because it's an analog synth, and these waveforms aren't playing at like the exact same phase. They're not oscillating at the exact same rate, and them not being the exact same shape doesn't help that. That's a very desirable thing in analog synthesis for many people, because it has that natural movement. However, if you listen closely, it can kind of be, some people find it distracting. Here you go. It's the, so there's this button on oscillators called Sync that forces oscillator 2 to reset at a point that is relative to oscillator 1, so that they are always perfectly in phase. So that movement's gone now, which can lead to a more stable sound, but it can kind of make it boring, because a lot of the draw of analog synthesis is that kind of variation in the back. If you wanted it to be a little bit less dirty, you could just use Serum, right? That's sort of what these are for. Is there, quirks and weird little bells and whistles that are kind of hard to emulate in digital. But okay, so I rest that point. So far, we've said if we want to kind of start a sound from scratch, we choose oscillator 1 and filter, and then we choose our waveform. If we want another sound under it, we choose oscillator 2 and we choose our waveform. If we want them to be sunk up so that there's no kind of like odd analog sounds, we click sync. In this case, we're going to keep sync off, because I do like the analog sound. So that's kind of how you develop a very basic patch, but it doesn't really sound very interesting. I'm going to kind of jump somewhere that typically, you know, you wouldn't see in an intro video so fast, which is this button here called page 2. So on most synths that are modern, there's a mixing section where you can say, I don't really want oscillator 2 to be so loud. And there's this button here beside oscillator 2 called noise. If I click that, the noise is kind of brutally loud. There's, as you can see, no kind of overtly obvious mixing section here. So you access it in this button called page 2, and the menu pops up right here. So if I click page 2, I have something called oscillator 1 level, and I can move this bank knob to oscillator 2 level, and I can move it again to noise level. So if I want oscillator 2, or in this case, let's just do noise. If I want noise to be quieter, then I would go over to the noise, and then I would hold this down just to kind of see how it sounds, and I'd use this group value knob to turn the volume down. It's at 127, which is the loudest you can set your mix level to on any oscillator or noise right out the box. So you kind of have only, you know, down to go. So if I was to hold this C, you can hear me gradually turning it down. So I just turn the noise down. It's still there. It's very quiet, but it's still there. So that's nice because it gives you the ability to say, you know what, maybe I want the noise. Maybe I'm kind of a fan of that static, for whichever reason. There's no rights or wrongs in analog synthesis, and I just feel it's too loud. So that's how you turn that down. Page 2 brings you to the mixer. So again, one more recap. We've covered how to turn on the oscillators, how to choose their waveform, and how to mix their characteristics together. You might say, for now, we're leaving oscillator 1 and 2 at the same volume, but eventually you might be like, yeah, you know, I don't really want oscillator 2 to be so loud, especially when you get into modulation. But so where do you go from here? This sound is pretty harsh, I'd say. So typically you start filtering kind of to bring in the characteristics that you're most interested in. That's why we call it subtractive synthesis, because now we have a sound and we want to shape it by removing elements, be it through modulation or our filter, sometimes filter modulation, to kind of shape it into something that we want. We remove qualities to kind of bring forth the qualities that we are most interested in. So this frequency knob, like as we kind of went over in the beginning, controls how much is cut off from the high end. This type button chooses how the filter kind of responds when you utilize this frequency knob. Me personally, I appreciate when both lights are lit up, you have the strongest filter. It reminds me the most of the Mini Moog filter, which I'm a huge fan of. So you can kind of start from there, and maybe you don't want it to be so harsh. You just kind of pull it to remove some frequency. Still pretty harsh. Okay, so that's kind of a bit more. A bit more Rhodesy almost. And that is how you utilize the filter. You just kind of choose what you want, kind of sonically. There's no rights or wrongs. That's just how it works. So you can kind of start using it right away if you're interested. The next and most, for some people, daunting section that we're going to cover is the envelope section. It's not that hard. Again, attack kind of just says how long do I want it to take for me to reach max volume. So if I hold the button here, or any note, and then gradually increase the attack, you can hear it kind of slope up. And sustain over here says how loud, once it slopes up, do I want it to be when it falls? You know, like typically if you're an instrumentalist and you strike a string on a guitar, the initial hit, the transient, is going to be the loudest point. The string will ring out until it's quiet, until there's no more noise. And that's sort of like, in the case of a guitar, the sustain ends up being 0. so no noise. But how long it takes to get to that 0 is the decay. In this case, we don't necessarily have to have the sustain be no noise. We can say maybe once it reaches the top volume, we want the sustain to be 20% of the lattice volume. So we just choose that over here. So right there, you can kind of hear it go, that it reaches max volume and then it drops very fast. The decay knob is really why it sounds so harsh. See, as I move the decay, it kind of takes longer to fall until it kind of sounds like it goes slope up and then it drops down to a level of our choosing. That level that we choose is done through the sustain knob. And then the release knob is when we take our finger off of the keyboard, how long do we want the note to kind of ring out for until it eventually ends up being 0. So a really high release ends up doing this, which kind of gives like a reverb effect almost. We don't have effects built into this like some other synths, so that's kind of how we achieve that, like a little bit of a workaround. And as for the filter envelope, it's kind of the same thing. I'm not going to dig too deep into the filter envelope as it is a beginner video, but the way that the filter envelope works is it sets an envelope that says, I want the filter to open in this, based on the envelope that we kind of develop. So if I close the filter all the way and I use this modulation knob, which says, yes, I want what we set over here to impact the filter. I'm going to turn it all the way up so that we get full impact. And I set attack very, very long. You'll hear the filter gradually open. Sustain says how much do we want it to close. And decay says how long do we want it to take to close. So filter envelope is a bit interesting. I do plan to make an advanced video if I get comments down below, and I'll cover the filter envelope in a bit more detail. But for the sake of the simplicity, again, if you want to choose your sounds, basic oscillators to begin with, you just click oscillator 1 and 2 on here, and you kind of build your sounds up over here, and you can start filtering in the filter section. Same section that you turn the oscillators on, and then over in the basic program, you click page 2 to select your mixer, and then you can use this knob here, the bank knob, to choose the oscillator 1 level, oscillator 2 level, or noise level, and you can start mixing things in. And then over in the filter envelope section and volume envelope section, you can kind of choose a little bit more interesting characteristics in the case of if you want things to change over time while you're holding a note. Okay, so now for the more, I guess, interesting and fun stuff, the modulation section. This is a cool section. Essentially, the way it works is that you utilize this LFO knob to choose a low frequency oscillation rate, which is, in this case, we're going to use the sine. So it goes up, down, and that up, down motion is essentially the same thing as taking, I guess, a robotic hand and grabbing whatever we send it to. In this case, let's send it to the filter, and having a robotic hand open and close the frequency. Okay, so you can hear now when I hit a note, the filter goes wow, 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 wow. So it opens and closes as though I was like, I could turn the filter modulation off right now and go like this. And achieve the same thing, but that's obviously not practical in designing a patch. So you choose your LFO rate, which is the rate it goes wow, wow, wow at, and then you send the LFO to control any parameter that's available listed here. So in this case, we're going to choose a filter. Which opens the filter. And the LFO says how fast we want it to happen. And then the depth knob says how, I guess, how mixed in do we want that effect to be. It's kind of nice, you know, you can do a lot with modulation. For example, if I was to hit oscillator 1 and turn off filter, then it would be modulating the pitch of oscillator 1, which is a disturbing sound, but it gives you options. You can do a lot with pitch modulation as well for, you know, to create interesting effects. For example, if I was to turn on oscillator 2 and then mix it down at about half the volume of oscillator 1, and then pitch modulate that, it wouldn't be so overt that it would ruin the key that we're in. It wouldn't sound too out of tune. It would just add some interesting pitch movement in the very back of the patch. So it kind of gives you some movement options. So that oscillator 1 destination sends the LFO to the pitch of oscillator 1. Oscillator 2 destination sends the LFO to the pitch of oscillator 2. The filter sends the oscillation to the filter, and it opens and closes it. Then over here in this destination section, we have our pulse wave modulation, which chooses how wide the pulse wave is. And then we have our volume modulation, which turns the volume of the synth up and down. So the volume's going up and down. If I turn the filter modulation on at the same time, then the filter opens when the volume comes up and the filter closes when the volume goes down. Which is just another interesting kind of effect. And we can change from sine wave, which is a smooth wah, 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 to a square which goes up and down. So it's like a harsher form of modulation. But as you can hear, it kind of adds some interesting flavor, right, to your patch. And then if you want to turn down maybe the depth of how deep the volume cut is, or vice versa, you can make it so that the modulation impacts the filter less than the volume. I hear that click noise that's coming from the modulation of the volume, and that would be very nice to put through some reverb. It would kind of create like a spacey cerebral vibe, especially because this is a polyphonic stereo synth natively. Yeah, so that's essentially how you utilize modulation after choosing your oscillators here and then choosing their bass form, waveform here, and then you cut some of the frequency out that you don't want, and maybe you impact the envelopes a bit. You don't even really have to touch the envelopes if you're not into what they offer, and then you move over to modulation to add some movement. And then over here, we have our control section. So this allows us to detune oscillator 2 if we want. Which is nice because it kind of adds some analog fat width to the second oscillator. Detuning it a little bit, it adds some more movement, and at the end of the day, movement is kind of an important thing in synthesis because it provides the viewer and the listener with new and interesting, I guess, kind of combinations of waveforms and interactions between the waveforms that sort of result in the track itself feeling more alive, right? Like when you're working with digital software, and the waveforms are like all perfectly sunk up, and it's kind of like a strong synth patch. You don't really get the quirks of analog, and you kind of lean into them a bit more when you work with analog synths. Again, you don't really have to. You can, if you want to, you can come over to the sync section and line everything up to remove some of that right off rip and not do any detuning, but it's up to you. Again, analog synthesis, and synthesis in general, there are no rights or wrongs. It's all kind of just a matter of how you want to approach it. So you have the vintage knob here. It's a bit challenging to hear the vintage knob right off rip, but what it does is it tells the Oberheim to act more like a vintage Oberheim, which is nice because it kind of adds, again, more of that back end width. What you'll find is with analog synthesis, you start with your basic patch and you mold it into something, and over the course of you molding it into whatever your heart or your brain or your plan tells you to mold it into, you kind of forget how far you've come. A basic square wave or a triangle wave or a saw wave it sounds nothing like what we currently have right now. And that's the beauty of it. So you look for little knobs like vintage that kind of add more analog flavor and wherever you can take them. Portamento says, how much do I want my notes to slide around? So let's hit a note up here. And then down here, you can hear it kind of boom, boom, boom. It's falling down. And then if you turn Portamento, about halfway, it happens faster. So this is the speed at which notes glide around. And then you have your unison button. So this button, I'm going to turn Portamento off. And I'm actually going to turn modulation off for a second here. We can no longer play polyphonic. It sums the power of the synth down to whichever one note you play, and it kind of gives you a monosynth amount of kind of power, right? This is very helpful for building bass. So if I was to take this transpose button over here and press down, as you can hear, we have a kind of a fat bass coming together. This is where detune comes in handy, specifically for bass lines. So that's a pretty big sound. If I turn unison off, turn detune off, and turn back on our modulation, and turn transpose up, you can almost hear how this now sounds like a pad, a bit of a moving pad, but a pad. It wasn't a huge leap from that pad to the bass. It was a matter of turning on unison and messing with the detune a bit and turning off the modulation. But at the end of the day, you'll find that it's very interesting if you experiment with these tools kind of laid out before you. How quickly and easily patches can jump from one use case to another. And then you have the velocity and touch options. Let's use touch. I find it nice and easy to explain. I'm going to turn modulation off here. So that's the sound. It almost sounds like a bit brassy. If I push down and then I push harder down for aftertouch, the filter will open. Which is interesting for more expressive playing. And how it works is you can choose between filter and modulation, or both at once. And velocity, same kind of thing. So here, let's try volume velocity. So how light you hit determines how loud the synth outputs. Let's turn the filter on for aftertouch. So you can kind of see that now that we've turned those two on, we have options for expressive playing. So that's pretty much the entirety of the synth. You have your expression playing over here, which I will touch on in an advanced video if anybody's interested. But for the sake of it now, there is this little hook over here on the right side of this split, and that controls pitch bending. which can help for, again, even more expressive playing. So for a quick rundown, and from the top, a signal flow of this synth is that you choose right away the sound of the oscillators, or sorry, which oscillators you want to fire over here in filter. Once you've turned on oscillator 1, oscillator 2, or both, you can then choose which waveform in the oscillator section you want them to represent. From there, you can control the filter, where you can choose how strong you want the filter to be, or how much high end you want cut off with this filter knob here. From there, if you want to start choosing how, when you press down, quickly the sound reaches max volume or drops, or if there's sort of a reverb effect you want, you use the release over in the filter section. And then from there, if you want more movement, you'd use the low frequency oscillation to send the sound or the effect of the LFO over to any of the parameters listed here, be it oscillator 1 pitch, oscillator 2 pitch, filter, pulse wave modulation for oscillator 1, pulse wave modulation for oscillator 2, or volume. The destination has depth knobs, and these determine how mixed in you want that effect to be. And then over here in control, you can play around with more expression, where you can say, maybe I want aftertouch, this touch button here, to open the filter, and maybe I want my velocity to control my volume. Vintage adds some more movement and variation to the low end to emulate older Oberheim synths. Portamento is the sliding of the notes, and then you have your oscillator 2 detune, which allows for some more width. So realistically, if you just mess around with that, you can kind of create anything you really want. This is what we have right now. Turn the portamento up. You got like the THX film intro. So that is essentially the Oberheim OB-X8 in a nutshell. If I was to reset the sound that we've built now, turn off portamento. It would sound like this. Just a bit of a kind of a reminder of how far we've come over the course of the video. It's kind of just a shoot explanation down the top, no script, in the way of kind of to demonstrate how impromptu you can kind of develop sounds from scratch, as long as you're comfortable with the signal flow, which I know I've reiterated it a million times, but you choose your oscillators, which ones you want on, you choose their tone, and their waveforms. You can choose to kind of cut some high end off. You can mess with your envelopes over here. And then in modulation, you can send a specific LFO automation to wherever these parameters allow. And then over here in control, you can choose whether or not you want unison on, which gives a lot more beef to one notes, individual notes for bass lines or leads. And then over here, you have your expression options. That's realistically the entire synth in a nutshell. If you have any questions, or if you want more succinct videos, I'm always happy to make them. Just leave a comment down below if you're interested in something like that, and I will do my best. If you enjoyed the video, if you could leave a like and subscribe, that would mean a lot to me. If you have any complaints, comments, or concerns, please do leave them in the comment section so that I can, rectify, or I can make a better video in the way of what you specifically need, because I'm very happy because I have access to this gear to do that for you. Especially if you're a beginner coming into subtractive synthesis or analog synthesis, it can be very overwhelming, and I am extraordinarily happy to expand on any explanations and open up new doors for you to utilize your tools to their fullest potential. Because I know when I first started using the synth, I was like, okay, well, where do I even begin to turn on my oscillators? Where do I even begin to mix? Which is, again, page 2. You can choose oscillator 1, 2, noise, etc. And you can use this value knob to control how loud the oscillator is. For example, that's me turning down oscillator 1. And it's not extremely intuitive off rip, being that the oscillators turn on in filter and you choose the oscillator shape over here in oscillators, where I feel like you should also turn on the oscillators, it's a fair way to be confused. And then having the filter, it's sometimes it feels a bit disjointed, and I can understand that. It's definitely not left to right. But that's okay. Once you get used to it, it's a very interesting and unique tool. I'm a Moog guy, but I find this to be more and more enjoyable the more I play it. So again, I would love more reasons to play it. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, leave them down below. Please leave a like and subscribe if you're interested in more content like this, and I am extremely happy to help. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will hopefully see you on another video.